caveat, I do read books. But I'm here to talk about my passion for comics. When I was a little kid, my mom read them to me on her knee. My dad took me to comic book conventions. I used to scissor them out and make my own stories, and I actually tried making my own comic with my parents. As I grew older, I developed a passion for art. That's my wife there in the portrait. Together, we enjoyed collecting. We collected Russian, Soviet Impressionism. We collected Japanese woodblock prints. And together, it finally occurred to me to merge the two together, and I started collecting comic book art. The one in the center is actually called a Grail piece. You saw a Grail in the tarot presentation. This is called a Grail piece among comic book collectors. So looking at the trajectory of literally across the world collecting comic book art and regular art, so where does the comic book art kind of fit in the whole juncture of it? Is it real art, or is it just something else? So comics have actually gained a lot of critical credibility. They're in museums, they're graduated from sort of being just kid stuff since the 1970s. There's great diversity of comics that hadn't existed before. And then you beg the question again, is it art? Well, originally the publishers didn't think so. They didn't credit artists, they didn't return the art back to them, and it was very handcrafted. It wasn't until pop art emerged in the 60s, and there are some great examples in this museum of pop art, when they appropriated comic book art. Appropriated meaning copying or otherwise being influenced by. But is it art? And Marvel appropriated the appropriators and called their own comic books pop art. So pop art appropriated a lot of things, including soup cans. You can find a buffalo head nickel down there. Didn't elevate comic art necessarily. It increased the visibility, but comics were still kind of in the dungeon. So I was going to show some examples of how pop art appropriated comic book art, but I found that it was difficult to get anything from Creative Commons, difficult to get permissions. So I leave it to you to take your own investigative tour of that. Basically, the appropriators didn't want to get appropriated, which you could view as ironic in a pop art sense, or you could view as hypocritical or ironically hypocritical. But either way, it was difficult. So how's comic art doing apart from being viewed through the lens of pop art? Actually, surprisingly well. This has been a good year for comic art. A page that I'm showing here from the 1980s generated 100,000 in auction. It's getting critical acclaim in places like the Smithsonian. They're doing graphic novel ratings, which doesn't necessarily dumb book reading down. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art just did a retrospective on comic art and the fashion of comics. So, from being invisible in the 30s and 40s, from an artistic standpoint, now collectors can choose from about 6,000 pages every month of comic book art. So it's kind of a watershed. Excuse me. And with all that volume, is actually greater diversity than ever before. Artists are doing things that are interesting with ink wash. They're doing watercolors. They're experimenting with the very boundaries of the format itself. So with all this going on, increased collectability, increased popularity, what's the problem? Is comic book art seems to be on top of the world at this point then. Well, comic art was actually WYSIWYG because everything was hand done, even the paste up of the word balloons and everything else. So WYSIWYG is going the way of a lot of things in the digital world, and with more separations, you're getting farther removed from the full-color page that you enjoyed when you were reading it in the first place. And with even more digital, you don't have to do anything at all with the written page or the hand-drawn, hand-inked, hand-lettered page. So where does that leave comics? Are we going back into the dungeon of being invisible as an art form? Not necessarily. Art is, there will be degrees of separation from the thing that you liked, but it's up to you to choose if it's still valid for you, and if it's still valid, by all means, embrace it. And comics have been dabbling in fully digital art since the 80s. Comics embrace the new. They're all about creative destruction, and it's a great time to be enjoying comic book art. There's basically, art is where you find it. Don't subscribe to any old-fashioned views about what art is or is not. It's a great time to enjoy comics, and I look forward to reading them to my kids. So, thank you.